Welcome to the Notebook, everybody. We're November 20th, and I'm Marc-Antoine Godin with Arpin Basu. Arpin, you must remember Dennis Green, former Arizona Cardinals head coach, who went on a famous rant on, that we could see on YouTube. We can easily find it on YouTube. And his line was, they were exactly who we thought they were, talking about their opponents. Well, do we know exactly who are the Montreal Canadiens?
Who are these guys?
Yeah.
This is I think this is actually, I think this is a clearer question to maybe us or fans or outside observers than it is to the actual Canadiens themselves. And I think we're seeing that play out sort of in real time. It was pretty extraordinary for me to see Martin St. Louis call his team soft in that game against Boston on Saturday, which is not inaccurate by any stretch, is actually quite on point. But to me, I look at sort of some of the comments and some of the disappointment coming from the Canadiens with their play of late as being exactly that lack of awareness of who they are and where they should be and where they find themselves in their developmental arc. And I have a hard time
in the sense that they miss they mistake their ambitions for their self-evaluations.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to kind of unpack here. When we're sort of embarking on a conversation like, who are these guys? I think that answer is unclear right now. Martin St. Louis mentioning after the game, well, we've had a lot of tough teams on our schedule lately. Well, that's how the NHL works, right? I mean, you're supposed to, you have games against difficult teams, and if you're a good team, then that doesn't matter as much. And if you're a team like the Canadiens, which is not a good team, how bad a team they are, I think, is up for debate, but they're not one of the upper echelon. They're not a top tier team in the league. No one would argue with that, except for maybe the Canadiens themselves. But, we're seeing things of late that teams in the position the Canadiens find themselves in go through quite regularly and shouldn't be a cause for alarm. But Martin St. Louis in particular, and even some of the players, I think, seem a little alarmed by it, which I guess is good because you don't want them to just accept like, oh, we're bad, so this is fine. No one wants that. But it's a shift, I think, from the way Martin sort of managed this team last year, knowing as well as he did that even his own management team wanted the team to lose as much as possible, to this year where Kent Hughes came out quite bluntly at the end of last season, again at the beginning of this season, saying that standard has changed. That word standard is getting tossed around a lot. So what is the Canadian standard? Is it fair to make the two first games against Vegas and Boston their standard? Or is their standard somewhere closer to the second game against Vegas and Boston, which we just saw their last two games?
Yeah, well, a standard means something it becomes the norm at some point. It becomes, this is where we're at. Yeah. And they take it to mean sometimes their standard is we're establishing what we're capable of doing. Right. But there's a big difference of establishing what you're capable of doing and then doing it on a regular basis. And I think that there are some occasions where when they bring their A game, you say, oh, okay, that's who they can be. That's not necessarily who they are. That's not necessarily who they are yet. But that's certainly what they can be. And after that, it's a matter of consistency, and it's clearly not there. And it's funny because today after practice, we heard Martin St. Louis say, it's what he was asked to identify what was going wrong, basically. He mentioned a couple of things, risk management. He mentioned the lack of forecheck against Boston. But he also said, sometimes it feels like you're trying to patch something and then something else will start leaking. And Matheson echoed exactly the same thing. So it's not just one fire to extinguish. There's not one issue in particular that needs to be tackled. And when you feel like there's many things all at once that are contributing to you not performing, that's when you put yourself in a position where there can be a string of losses. This team has already lost 4 in a row. They're embarking on a trip to California that's never been very hospitable to them. So we're looking at a team that could take a serious dip in the coming days if they don't find their mojo back. They're already struggling. Marty was answering to one of your questions, saying that they're already looking like they're struggling with their mental toughness a little bit. Well, if they don't address that fast, maybe, except for the potential game against San Jose, who's got 3 wins only so far this season.
All 3 of them in regulation, though.
Yeah, more than the Canadians. Yeah,
more than the Canadians. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a trip that could really put them in the red, because we've seen them, flirting with a line that was slightly above 500 for a while, with great goaltending and some favorable PDO. But when you look at the way it's starting now they're 25th in the league, and it could go worse than that as the games go by. So I as much as we like to hear them say, it's a good time to go on the road, get together, and bond and whatnot on the ice concretely, it could be a long trip.
Yeah. And, it's always a good time to go on the road. I've never heard a player say, man, it really sucks that we're going on the road right now. Like you said, players get asked this all the time. Is this a good time for your team to go on the road? Just once I want to hear a player say, no. You know what? No, it's not. The timing is terrible. So, of course, it's a good time to go on the road. The team is struggling, spend some time together, bonding. I think the Canadiens' rookie dinner is planned in Los Angeles. They're going to be gone for 10 days. They're going to spend a lot of time together. And, of course, the timing is perfect. It's always perfect. But, I thought, the question that Marty was answering when he questioned his team's, he wondered about his team's mental toughness, or saying that it was being challenged right now. One thing about mental toughness is that it has nothing to do with skill or ability or anything other than the makeup of the players themselves and how they form a cohesive unit, and how they can how it's a part of toughness. It's a part of team toughness, being mentally tough, not allowing a single goal against to deflate you. So the question that I asked on that was, how we mentioned that they had some difficult teams on their schedule of late. If he had realized early in the season, when the team was off to a good start, that they had gotten a very favorable schedule, and that was partly fueling the good start. And he said he did, even though if you go back to what he said at the time, I don't think there was much evidence of him acknowledging the favorable start, other than the fact that they were playing. I think they played 4 games in the first 2 weeks of the season. But he said, I kind of knew that the schedule was going to get tough. And earlier in his media avail after practice Monday, he mentioned how, you get judged on when times are tough, not when times are good. And so the Canadiens are being judged right now. And I think it goes beyond where they are in their development arc. It goes beyond what their own expectations for them should be. I mean, the mental toughness part is something that you would like to see shine through from some of the core guys, and so, what Marty did in Boston, I thought was really interesting, aside from calling the team soft after the game, which is, DEFCON 1, I guess it would be, or 5. I forget what direction that goes in, but anyhow, it's in coach speak. That's used sparingly. Let's say it's not something you want to call your team.
It's a bullet that he's firing.
Yes. Yeah. And he made reference earlier this season to, which I think you asked him about today, was, going into the room between periods against Winnipeg, was it? Or Columbus? Winnipeg, yeah. And really laying into his team after what was an awful first period, and how he can only do that a certain number of times. Well, calling your team soft is something that coaches are pretty loath to do and don't. And he wasn't asked do you think your team played soft tonight? He just volunteered it on his own in his opening comments. It's kind of funny how it came out of him. He's like, yeah, Boston played really well tonight. And, we did what I, oh, and also I found we were soft. It's just kind of like, he just kind of threw it in.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa, okay, that's a bit of a bomb from Martin. But when he brings up the mental toughness and how it's challenging them right now, that's an area where even a bad team can be mentally tough. I mean, even if you're bad, especially when you're bad, actually, is when you need to display that sort of mental toughness. So this is something that's within their control. And it's something that kind of speaks to sort of the makeup of their core, I think.
Yeah.
And if those guys are unable to get through this relatively minor adversity, I mean, listen, expectations externally are still low on this team. No one's really flipping out over their record. I mean, if you asked anyone, where are they at now? You said they were 25th in the league overall.
Yeah.
They're last in their division. They're pretty much where people expected them to be. I mean, listen, if the draft lottery were held today, they'd be, they'd have the 8th best odds. Is that right? 2, 4, 6. Yeah, 8th best odds. Prior to the season, we were saying they might not be bad enough for a top 5 pick, but they'll probably be somewhere in the top 10, hovering around maybe early teens, somewhere in this range, which they're still, they're going through a tough stretch here. I mean, I think they are going to have a bounce back stretch at some point where they start winning some games. There's a lot of Cole Caulfield's not scoring goals. Josh Anderson famously has not scored a single goal. There's a lot of things going wrong, and the Canadiens are where they are despite those things. And so now those things are coming to the forefront. I was looking at Cole Caulfield's shooting percentage on the power play today. It's at 2.3%.
Yeah.
He was at 12.5 last year, and 11.1, I think, the year before. So there'll
be a regression to the norm at some point.
There will be at some point. Josh Anderson scores 23 to 27 goals just about every year. I mean, his goal totals at the end of the season, if you look at his career, have been remarkably consistent. They're pretty much, you can bank on X number of goals from that guy. So there's going to be a regression there, and they'll start to win some games. But I think the lesson for at least Martin St. Louis and not really his players is to keep any hot streak or cold streak in perspective of who they are. And maybe this is creating a greater realization to Martin that this is who they are, and these things are going to happen. You're going to go in these stretches where your team's playing poorly, where they're springing leaks all over the place, and you're playing whack-a-mole trying to fix them. It's the reality of the Canadiens right now, and their early start to the season, based on what Martin himself admitted was a favorable schedule, was not a clear or accurate snapshot of what this team is.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Caulfield and Anderson as guys who obviously have been going through a rough patch and a cold streak offensively, because they're part of the core. Anderson, if only because of his age, he's supposed to be in one of the few players on this team who's meant to be in his prime right now. Probably Mike Matheson's the other one. But when those two guys cannot find the back of the net, after that, it's easy to make a connection between that sort of cold spell and a team that struggles, to overcome adversity, or that's battling it mentally, and lacks that mental toughness. But it affects also secondary players. After the game in Boston, Jonathan Kovacevic said, it's not that we were facing the Bruins and we were going into a hostile environment and whatnot that made us play like that. But when you start off your game and you can see right from the get-go that the team as a whole is not on his A game, then the first few mistakes, added to the fact that you're in a hostile environment, makes it that much more difficult to hold on to your game. And that's where the emotions can take over. And he said, personally, I know that they did take over, and they got the best of me. He ended up having 6 minutes of penalties. Obviously, there was a double minor in the lot, plus another penalty at some other point in the game. But even for a guy like Kovacevic, it's just that there are situations that become overwhelming. And you got to wonder if Anderson is struggling, is in his own head right now, if Caulfield is in his own head right now, are there enough players to support Suzuki and I would add Brendan Gallagher to that, in the leadership aspect to make sure that there is, and I hate to, whenever there's a team that goes on a losing streak, I hear so many pundits talk about the lack of leadership, and I don't want to do that because I think that it's an easy way out. But it's not the losing streak that leads me there. It's more the question of mental toughness. Say you have to have guys that are going to be able to steer the group back together and say we're going to overcome this. It can come from the coach, it can come from the captain, but it can come from everybody. And that comes, maybe it's a byproduct of having so many guys that are just young, up-and-coming players that are stitched to another group of guys that are older or guys that are trying to prove themselves either because of age or because of injury history. But you have to find a way to connect those two groups together and make a coherent whole out of this. And when we ask ourselves, who are these guys? I think that trying to accomplish something with the younger guys and trying to accomplish something with the older guys makes a connection that is not always cohesive. I'm not sure if that's,
I think that's, yeah, it wasn't all that cohesive, but I do understand what you're talking about. It's
not me, but me, the team. But if you think that my argument is not cohesive, I'm all right with that.
I'm just kidding. I'm just saying, no, I do understand what you're saying. And I think that comes down to, that is the crux of the question, right? Often when you think of leadership in bad times, I think back to Max Pacioretty in Anaheim, kind of falling on his sword as captain, that classic rant of how am I supposed to tell guys what to do when I'm the worst player on the ice and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And he was right in the sense that was a very self-aware thing. He's like, listen, I can hardly go up to someone and say, hey, you're not pulling your weight when I am the biggest culprit of not pulling my weight. I can't do that. And there's definite truth to that. I mean, we talked to Sean Monahan after practice today. That's not a guy who's brimming with confidence in his game right now, especially after the strong start that he had with his line of late. It hasn't gone well. And frankly, his game in Boston was probably the worst game he's played in a Canadiens uniform. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Shot attempts at 5-on-5 with Sean Monahan on the ice were 22-2 for Boston. 16-0 unblocked shot attempts. He was on the ice for 0 expected goals. 0. Yeah. It's just like, it's so, and you could see it in his face talking after practice today. He's like, listen, and at one point he said, I still think we're a good team. We're capable of X, Y, Z based on these games that we played in the past, but he's not in a position as a leader on the team, as a veteran, to go up to someone and be like, hey, you should be doing this, 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 when he's getting lit up right now. I mean, it's night and day from where he started the season. So there's some truth to that Pacioretty rant from several years ago. That's just a reality in a dressing room. Leadership starts with yourself and how you play. It starts by leading by example. And once you do that, then maybe you can vocally go to some of these younger guys and be like, hey, this, you need to do this, or you need to, start to try and help others, but you can't do that until you've helped yourself. And so when you have a lot of the older guys kind of fighting it a little bit right now, Tanner Pearson has been a less effective player than he was earlier in the season, finds himself on the fourth line Saturday. I would say Brendan Gallagher's play hasn't actually dipped all that much, but definitely had a spell with those bad penalties and what have you. And so he's
minus 13 in his last 8 games. So that's something that tells a part of the story. But he was happy enough about this his play so far this season to say, well, I'm more comfortable acting as a leader for the exact reason that you brought up, because he feels more comfortable with his game. He feels like he's contributing. Hence, he can go to other players and try to ignite something and share ideas and use his leadership. When you're when you're searching for yourself and you're deep in a hole, or you're frustrated, or and things are not working well for you, you have to fix yourself before you can think of fixing others.
Exactly. And I mean, good on Gallagher if that's how he feels. And I don't know if, plus minus is an imperfect stat, of course.
Yep.
I think in Gallagher's case, him bringing the quality he has of dragging the team into the fight, I think is still there. I mean, we've seen him be a lot more combative. He's in the blue paint the way he used to be in his prime years. His shot generation numbers are very strong. This is definitely a new and improved Brendan Gallagher from the banged up, taped together version we saw the last couple of years. But who's really playing well right now on the team? I mean,
it's a good question.
Nick Suzuki, kind of.
Yeah,
Gallagher.
He's playing well.
I mean, I still think Gooley's playing well, even though he's had a couple of maybe more difficult games, but he's been one of the more consistent players. Matheson's been a roller coaster all season. Kovacevic, frankly, I mean, he had a tough one on Saturday, but otherwise has been pretty good for what he is. I mean, I think there's a pretty low ceiling on Kovacevic. I think he's playing close to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's about it. I mean, and
maybe Barron too, a little bit.
Maybe Barron too. Yeah, not even a little bit. I think he's settling into something pretty interesting, I think, for the Canadians. But that's it. So
yeah.
if that's your subset of players who can.
Oh, and the goalies.
Well, yeah, the goalies, but the goalies are a whole separate matter. They're dealing with their own stuff on their own. They're a crowded bunch and they're dealing with their own things. But if the subset of players who can kind of lift the team out because they're playing well is that Suzuki, Gooley, Barron, maybe Gallagher, not a whole lot else. I mean, yes, Suzuki's the captain, and so I think he does do that. He does talk to guys and try to help them out. But I mean, that's a small subset of players on this team, and it doesn't include some of the more veteran guys. So it's and there's one guy that we brought him up earlier talking about the show. We didn't really decide to talk about him, but Alex Newhook, I think, is an interesting sort of case study for where this team is at. I spoke to him last week because it just dawned on me that for the first time in his life, really, he's changing organizations. You don't really do that in minor hockey generally, and he hadn't done that until now. And so not only do you have the change of moving to a new city, learning about new teammates. I think the only guy he knew really was Justin Barron, more or less. Or maybe Gooley too from that World Junior team. But anyhow, didn't know a lot of guys on the team. Comes in, starts on the wing, quickly has to shift over to center after Kirby Dach is lost after the second game of the season. Goes back to the wing, is moving lines. It's just kind of been a constant state of flux in terms of the Newhook's runway to adapt to a new team. And on top of all that, he's got to learn how to play with Nick Suzuki, and it's a challenge. It's honestly like he didn't put it this way. Like he basically said it's really, you really have to be aware that he's always looking to make an offensive play. He's not playing simple hockey. So you have to be aware of that. You have to know, you have to expect that he's going to try to make an offensive play, anticipate what that play is, and put yourself in a position to take advantage of that offensive play. And even Suzuki kind of admitted last week that, it's a work in progress between those two. They're talking a lot on the bench between shifts. They talk a lot in the room between periods. It's an ongoing process. And I remembered, I think you were on that trip, right? That was the trip during the trip out west where I kind of jokingly asked Nick, like, why are you so difficult to play with?
Yeah,
he kind of laughed. He kind of laughed because I originally asked, the difficulty of finding someone to complete his line with Kim and Cole Caulfield, and then quickly followed with that. And then when Nick realized it was a joke, because I don't think he realized it was a joke. and he looked kind of sideways at me, and then he realized it was a joke, and he laughed. But
Well, it's like Sidney Crosby. It's been hard for the Penguins to find the proper line mates for him. You know, in
it
his
was hard for Team
career,
Canada.
Pascal Dupuis, Chris Kunitz, and Jake Gunzel. You know,
Yeah,
those three guys. But it's been over over 15-year career. It hasn't been easy for trying the right fit.
and
So
it's listen, we're not comparing Nick Suzuki to Sidney Crosby by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a similar dilemma, if you will, in the sense that Sidney Crosby sees the game in a way that only he does. Nick Suzuki's not at that level, but he does have a very unique way of seeing the game of hockey and how it's played, and how to take advantage of certain offensive situations. And Newhook was saying that in his time in Colorado, he hadn't really played with guys like that. Occasionally he did. He found himself on a line with Nate McKinnon from time to time, but was really kind of seen as the eventual replacement for Nazem Kadri when he left, and it didn't really work out that way. But he turned into more of a depth player, so he played a more simple game. And if you watch Newhook's games in Colorado last year, a lot of dump and chase, a lot of go establish the forecheck, get the puck back, cycle it, very meat and potatoes, simple kind of hockey, and that's not what you play with Nick Suzuki. And so it's I think he's a guy that would be fair to say the Canadians expected more from, but I think there's some justifiable reasoning for how slowly it's going in terms of his production and taking advantage of the added opportunities he's getting in Montreal. But early returns, almost a quarter of the way through the season, I think it'd be fair for the Canadians to expect more from him as well eventually. It's just not clear what path that's going to take.
yeah, well, I might be old-fashioned in that sense, but I feel like on every line there should be a guy who's willing to go to the net and be that net front presence, and that it's going to be his job. Who's going to be a puck retriever, and once it's established that when there's a setup in the offensive zone that's going to go in front of the net, and it's been very difficult for Suzuki and Caulfield to find that third person. And I'm not sure if Newhook is that kind of guy either, because he doesn't strike me as he's a guy who likes to carry the puck, uses his speed to good use, and he's not necessarily the guy who's going to battle the most one-on-one or fight for space on a regular basis. So
He did actually do that a lot. He did actually do that a lot in Colorado, though, and it struck me, like watching the video from him in Colorado last season. It did strike me. I was like, why are they asking Alex Newhook to do that? Like that just doesn't seem like a good use of his skill set. But he was pretty effective at it. Honestly, if you go back and look at his games last year in Colorado, like he got a lot of his goals in that area, kind of fighting for position with bigger defensemen, but he's a strong guy. Like he's similar to Suzuki in the sense that they're not the tallest guys, but they have a low center of gravity and they have a strong core that allows them to battle and to not be physically overwhelmed. And so that is something he did, but I agree with you that he's not the ideal. Like that's why I thought Raphael Harvey-Pinard would be a great fit with them, because he does that very well.
Yeah.
That didn't work out. And so I think that's always been the theory for Marty with Josh Anderson, why he always thinks Josh Anderson would be a good fit on that line, because he could be that guy that you're talking about. And the fact is he's not that guy, and has never been that guy. And he goes to the net on the rush, but not much of a net front presence once you're set up in the offensive zone. He's always in movement and tries to find soft areas. It's exactly what Caulfield does, which is, I think, why that line doesn't work. But I would agree with you that having a player who does that consistently and knows, like, to me, that's Harvey-Pinard. It's really the best fit for that line. If it was given some runway, and if Caulfield and Suzuki are to stay together, probably Harvey-Pinard. But it's been tough for him this season. And another guy who's probably fighting confidence, actually not probably, is definitely fighting confidence issues. Is currently injured, obviously, so he's not an option right now. But it seems to be the type of guy who could fill that role best among the people that they have available to them, but maybe they just don't have that guy right now.
Well, returning to Newhook for a moment, I mean, there's his own numbers, the fact that he has not produced a lot, but when he's been asked to play center, he's been flanked by guys who've been struggling offensively too. And you mentioned Anderson, Slavkovsky, guys like that. So there's a collection. Who are these guys? Right now, they're a collection of guys that are trying to figure themselves out, and it's hard to be a team when you guys are searching for their own identity and trying to find their game, and it's
they're
really
an island of misfit toys.
Completely. That's what it is, and so it's going to be a process. We could ask that question in 3 months from now, and we might come up with a very different answer. But if you take a snapshot of where the team is right now, there's a lot of puzzled faces in that locker room right now.
Well, I think, and also in the coach's office, the wholesale changes made to the forward lines on Saturday. Our last episode was spent talking about how Marty needed to make some changes. Then he went ahead and did that. So thanks for listening to the podcast, Marty. We appreciate it. But obviously he had nothing to do with it. But he did go full on, broke up the Monahan line, brought Suzuki and Caulfield back together, did all sorts of things, didn't look all that enthused with the result of those changes, obviously. No. After the game on Saturday, that's quite obvious. It didn't even last the whole game. I mean, swapped Monahan and Dvorak at some point during the game. But it's just been an ongoing issue for this coaching staff to find forward combinations that work. And it's not as if they've been decimated by injury. Listen, Kirby Dach is obviously a pivotal, critical piece that they lost very early in the season. And that's a fair mitigating factor, but it's one injury, and it's not a superstar level player. Yes, in the Canadiens ecosystem, very, very important forward, but you should be able to recover from an injury to Kirby Dach with the depth of talent you had at forward.
With a mix of Monahan, Newhook, and Dvorak, you should find a solution.
You should. And so I think it's on the coaching staff to make this group bigger than the sum of its parts, to make them not an island of misfit toys, to make them something, as you were mentioning earlier, a more cohesive group. And they haven't been able to find the right combinations. Now, are they dealing with the best possible pool of players? No, of course not. But I do think that's a challenge facing this coaching staff. Not only do they have to develop the mental toughness that Marty was talking about, this coming from a player who was the epitome of mental toughness. He mental toughed his way into the Hall of Fame. I mean, literally probably his number one attribute was his mental toughness, but that's not something you can really teach, right? That's internal. What he can do is continue working on the development of his young players. And I think that's when we ask the question, who are we? I think the answer for Marty has to be, we are a team in development. We are still in the development phase. Let's not get bogged down with the results. Let's continue making decisions that are development-based and not results-based would be an important answer to that. But I think he can help that development and the results by coming up with some configuration of this forward group that makes some sense. And they haven't seemed to been able to do that almost a quarter of the way through the season.
No, and some moves, putting Yesu Alonen on the second line against Boston was maybe a way to say, well, here's your chance, or we recognize the fact that in a limited role you've been doing a good job, so we'll go with merit. So that could be a development thing. But Marty has used on a few occasions, I won't call it necessarily a cop-out, but his argument at least was to say, Well, winning is part of development, so it's never been completely dissociated between
Oh, he's
development.
not wrong.
So development and results are not necessarily two goals that cannot go hand in hand. But it's a question that he himself, as a coach, in terms of the priorities for his team, he must ask himself, and the management too. I mean, when they look at this, or say, are they going to look at making it a shake up and say, okay, we're going to do something to try to win more games,
Hmm.
or are we going to refocus to the fact that we need absolutely our younger players, the under 23 or under 24 guys, to take a step forward and be better? What is it that we can do to make sure that Newhook takes a step forward, that Barron takes a step forward, that Caulfield finds his groove, and the rest might not be as important? It's a very difficult question to ask, but I think that or to answer, actually. It's easy to ask, but it's tough to answer. But this team is at a philosophical crossroads. Is to say we
Hmm.
wanted to win more, but we might not have the tools when we compare. Look, we were talking early in the season about standings, about the fact that the Canadians were deemed to finish last, were labeled as finishing last in their division, but there would be other teams, other rebuilding teams that were ready to make a real step forward. Everybody had the Buffalo Sabres on the tip of their tongue. Well, the Buffalo
Hmm.
Sabres are still struggling, and when you look at the Canadians, you say, okay, well, they could take a step forward and they could take another step forward next year. But it's a slow process to really climb up the ladder and climb up the standings from one year to the next. And when you take a team like the New Jersey Devils, who was able to do that within a span of 2 years, going from a bottom team to a team that's really, really competitive, to me, it seems like they're more the exception than the rule. More often than not, the young teams will fight for a long time before establishing themselves, if they ever do, because some of them will just entirely miss the boat. So there's a need for a lot of patience. But if I'm in the room with those players and I'm Martin St. Louis, I'm thinking, okay, patience is one thing, but I can feel around this, in this locker room, the impatience to win and to feel good
Hmm.
about ourselves. And that might taint his decisions too.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that's important. It's important that, and we've talked to Marty about this, and it's you can't you can't tell a veteran NHL player that you're sitting on the bench and this guy's going over the boards, even though he's fighting it and even though he's struggling, because we need to develop him. What does that do for what does the veteran player care about that? I mean, that's definitely a balance that needs to be struck, and I think he is striking that. Listen, it's not as if someone could argue maybe that Uri Slavkovsky deserved to sit at some point and didn't. Um, it definitely could have been an option used, but I think everyone in the Canadiens room sees the potential and the talent that he has, and how when he's playing at his best, he actually does help them win, whether he gets points or not. So I think that's a defensible decision to not scratch him. But I mean, I think we see it late in games where the Canadians are, you know, verging on a win, or they're protecting a lead, or they're tied or whatever. Like when crunch time hits, he'll sit certain guys. And there were times this season when he sat Slavkovsky for a couple of shifts in the third period in sort of critical situations. And I would argue that you shouldn't do that, that he needs to be in those critical situations. He needs to learn from them. And if you lose the result because of that, then so be it. Then it's a teaching opportunity, and then you have a chance to teach. Or if he sits uh, Ylonen as an example, or Caulfield in certain sort of defensive situations, like it's that's where he has to kind of balance things out, and that's where it's somewhat difficult to do sometimes. These players are in a fight. They're trying to win a game. How good Uri Slavkovsky is 2 years from now might not matter to a guy like Tanner Pearson, who could be long gone by then, or Sean Monahan, who could be long gone by then. So
Yeah.
it's always, and when you mention management, it's clear the Canadian. Canadiens management would want them to be more competitive. But if things turn out that the Canadiens are a bit more competitive than last season, but they still wind up with a pretty good draft pick, I'm not sure. I'm not sure management would consider that a total failure. I mean, there's really. I don't think management's going to go out and fix this for the Canadiens. Like, if they find an inability to win games, they're not going to go out and spend future assets on someone to bring someone in to help them win games. That's for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty convinced. I can be proven wrong if things go really off the rails. Maybe they do that. I doubt things will go that far off the rails, but because I just don't see them investing more in this team at this juncture. It's. I think when Canadiens management if they were to be given truth serum and asked, who are you? They would say we're a team that's not there yet. We're a team that needs more work. We're a team that needs development. We're a team that needs more talent. We're a team that needs a lot of things that we don't have yet. So this season, I think in their eyes, is important to building a certain culture and not allowing the culture of let's call it what it is, of tanking last season to some extent, where management quite openly was not opposed to them losing games, was not opposed to having a higher draft pick. They don't want that stench to stick to this team. Because you mentioned Buffalo, like a franchise where the stench of tanking stuck to a franchise, that's the Buffalo Sabres. That's stuck to them for a long time. But at the same time, if things just play out that way, I don't think Kent Hughes is going to be, throwing chairs in his office. It's not really something that's going to upset him that much. But it's, it's definitely.
It might upset Jeff Gorton more than Kent, though.
Yeah, perhaps.
Jeff Gorton is every loss stings.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And listen, if you look at how quickly they kind of turned things around in New York, maybe he saw it going the same way here. I don't see how you could reasonably do that, but I mean, it's there's no Artemi Panarin falling from the sky, and there's no Adam Fox falling from the sky in Montreal either. So there's a big difference between what happened in New York and what's going on here. But yeah. It's funny, like when you ask the question, who are we, you're likely to get, if you ask the players, the coaches, and management, who are the Montreal Canadiens, I feel you're likely to get three pretty different responses. According to Sean Monahan, they're a really good team who could beat any team in the league. That's as of Monday. So I just don't know how you can make that argument with a straight face just because you happen to play a couple of good games against a couple of good teams on two very separate occasions this season.
Yeah, but who are you versus who can you be it's two different questions, but it comes usually whenever I've asked that question or a variant of that question to a player or a coach, the answer is always based on how we think we can be. The how we project ourselves, how good we think we can be, how good we've been on certain occasions, and we hold on to this as who we are, rather than what's your base, what's your standard, how have you been on average? Have you been?
Yeah.
So
that's also two things that are different, because how you've been on average is clearly not, as we mentioned earlier, is not being used as the standard. They're using the best version of themselves as the standard. And right now, those best versions of themselves instances are outliers. And the standard is well below that. And so maybe they need to recalibrate a little bit, because maybe they're after an unattainable standard. And maybe that is what's leading to some of, Marty saying that playing good hockey games, he mentions the 4 games prior to the Vegas game as being like a subset or a sample of 4 good hockey games, and where they were playing good hockey, and they lost the last 2 of those games.
Yeah, they lost against Vancouver, and they lost against Calgary. Those are the 2.
If you look at the Vancouver game, I really don't know why that's included in that group. But anyhow, it's and so when I asked Marty after practice, to what extent do you think not getting the result in those last 2 games of those 4 games you're talking about led to the substandard performances against 2 of the best teams in the league, against Vegas and Boston. You said, yeah, it was a factor. And that's where the whole mental toughness thing came in, where they felt they played well, they didn't get the result, and it led to this. And it's just like so much of this Canadian season and so much of how Marty has described the team this year seems to me to be results based.
Yeah.
And Marty is the one screaming from the rooftops all the time that it can't be results based. And so they need to switch to a more process based evaluation system and stick to it. Because if they get bogged down in results, sorry to break it to you guys, but it's going to be a long year. So
you're bound to be disappointed. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I mean, their last regulation win goes back to October 23rd. That's a long time ago.
They have two.
So you want to look at results?
Wins. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
2 regulation wins in 18 games. That's a lot of games for 2 regulation wins. Listen, last week on Mailbag Monday, we took way too long to get to the mailbag. You can make the argument that we've done the same thing again this week, but we're going to get to the mailbag now because we have some interesting questions to pour over. Marc-Antoine, why don't you do the honors of picking the first one?
Okay. Habs fan 12 on our Twitter account asks, when will the 3-goalie situation be resolved, and what is your prediction on how it gets resolved? Well, all right, I'll start with that. I think the Canadians are in no rush to solve that situation. I think they want to solve it, but there's a couple of factors at play here. You mentioned Arpin earlier that Raphaël Harvey-Pinard is injured. The fact that he's been put on IR enabled the Canadians to call up a 7th defenseman, Jayden Struble, who's going to accompany the team out west. So they've got the flexibility on their roster. They don't have that because of an injured player for the next little while. They don't have the immediate pressure of solving that 3-goalie issue. There might be circumstances or conjunction at some point where it needs to be solved, but they've been able to dodge that bullet so far. I think in the grand scheme of things, they want to make sure that when they do move a goalie, they will have a certainty regarding Montembeault and his contract, and B, that they're going to be in a position of strength in trying to deal for a goalie. They cannot just give away a goalie and make their own need to solve that issue a bigger issue than the need of another team for a goalie. They need to deal from a position of strength, and as long as they don't have that, well, they might as well wait. Because sending down Caden Primo clearly is off the table because they know that another team is going to claim him. His last couple of starts show that he's ready for NHL duty. But I look at a team, for example, a team like New Jersey, who's been riding Vitek Vanecek and Akuria Schmid since the beginning of the season. They're a really good team, but they've been giving up a lot of goals. And Schmid is a guy who can still be sent to the minors and be waiver exempt. So if you look for teams that could use some help between the pipes, but they have a goalie that can be sent down without going through waivers, those teams might be the sort of teams that look that could pay some interest in Primo. So
it's actually our timing is not great. So we're recording this. It's currently 1:59 p.m. Eastern time. Yesterday, the Philadelphia Flyers finally put Felix Sandstrom on waivers. So their 3-goalie setup is about to be resolved quite imminently. So we're going to get back. There's going to be some clarity on the goalie market and the waivers and all that. So we'll get back to that. But yeah, I agree with everything you said. And there is definitely no rush from the Canadian standpoint to get this resolved. And I think with each passing day, each of the goalies are just starting to accept and kind of fall into a rhythm that is different from what they're used to, but is becoming their new reality, and they're just accepting it. Spoke to Caden Primo today, and it had been a while. Like today during practice, they had the second sheet of ice available to them in Brassard, and each goalie spent some individual time with Eric Clément on that second ice. And I spoke to Caden Primo about it because I was wondering, does Eric Clément have like a specified workout for each individual goalie? Or does he just go over there and work on the same things just with all three of them separately? Primo actually didn't know. He's like, but I think he kind of said, I think it's the same. I don't really know, to be honest with you. I just know what he does with me.
Right.
But he said sometimes it's based on the upcoming opponent and some of their tendencies. Sometimes it's based on stuff he saw that he feels needs to be cleaned up. So I'm still trying to get to the bottom. I'm going to talk to all three goalies eventually to see if they actually have personalized workouts. But main thing being that, it kind of struck me that Eric Raymond under this current system has a far greater workload than he used to. It's one thing being a goalie coach, spending like 20 minutes with the goalies before practice and then basically sitting back and watching practice, just basically what he does. Now, during practice, he's got a lot more work to do. He's got a lot more planning to do for workouts and what have you. So, but Primo said at one point, when I mentioned the increased workload, he kind of laughed. He's like, well, that's kind of my fault. And he said he texted him a little while ago to get out on the ice earlier because they didn't have that second sheet available to them or they were on the road, and asked him to do more work than he was doing. So Primo's being proactive with it. And I think he's starting to get his head around the fact that there's certain things he needs to do to stay sharp, and without taking away from the work that Jake Allen and Sam Montembeault are doing, maybe just adding to Eric Raymond's workload, but it's a new reality that he's wrapping his head around.
And the thing with the three goalies also, it's the training's different, the workload in terms of games played is different, but it's not broken. I mean, if there's been one position where Canadians have had success, have been trustworthy of their players, it's in the net. The three guys have done their part, so it's not a question of necessarily saying, well, if it's not broken, why fix it? There's still something I think that longer term needs to be fixed, but I think that each of those three goalies has made the most out of that situation. Primo needs to be patient just a little bit more, but he's really knocking at the door. It's within grasp whether he's traded to another team that will make him their number two goalie, or it's in Montreal where he finally finds his niche. I think that he sees the horizon is not so far away anymore. I think that there's an NHL future for him now, and I think that's a very positive development for him. Now, I think that how the situation is going to be resolved between what the Canadians would like to do and who's going to draw some interest on the market, it's two different things. Because even if the Canadians would say, well, in our minds, finding the right contract for Montembeault and being able to keep a younger goalie would be the ideal thing for us, other teams might look at Jake Allen and say, you know what, this is not the guy that we want. So it's going to be, until they find that arrangement, I find it unlikely that this will all be resolved. But that's where the negotiations with Montembeault will come into play. Because if, for example, Montembeault's agents say, okay, well, we want so much money for him and a deal cannot be struck, then he becomes a guy who could potentially help a team just down the stretch, because it'd be a UFA to be goalie. So unless there's
it'd be a rental.
It'd be a rental. And then, what sort of value would that generate for the Canadians to move, a mid-20s or late-20s guys who's a rental? I'm not sure of the return that they would get for him.
No, and I think they would rather. I think they would be more inclined, unless the return is considerable or fair at least, they would be more inclined to wait it out and try and sign him after the season. I mean, I think that's because I think there's a recognition, at least on the Canadians' part, that this might take a while for them to come to terms. And the one thing the Canadians know is that Sam Montembeault wants to stay in Montreal. He doesn't want to stay in Montreal at all costs. He's not going to leave millions of dollars on the table, but he wants to stay in Montreal. So that's. But it's true that I think that is the biggest sticking point, because the Canadians are fearful of a scenario where they lose Caden Primo for nothing or trade him for very little, which frankly, I mean, I don't think they could expect much of a return for Caden Primo at this point if they traded him, and then also lose Sam Montembeault to free agency afterwards.
No, they can do that.
That's the scenario that they are trying to avoid.
And while you were talking, goalie Felix Sandstrom has cleared waivers, and he's going to report to Lehigh Valley in the American League. So there you go.
There you go. So,
all right.
Caden Primo would have a chance to get through waivers. Who knows?
Maybe. All right. JJ Bowerman is asking us, can you give any insight on why Martin St. Louis only prefers certain players playing their off wing? I'll let you go first on that.
I think the answer is pretty simple. I think he'd prefer to have all players playing on their off wing. It's just that some players have just displayed an inability to do so. I think Brendan Gallagher is an example of that. Yoel Armia, we've seen play on the left side under Marty, which he never did before. Was always considered a right winger through and through. Josh Anderson's a guy who pretty much plays on the right wing almost exclusively, although Saturday night was an exception. But the preference would be that if a player can do it, we've seen Juraj Slafkovsky's more effective on the right side. Cole Caulfield has consistently played on the left side since Marty came in and generally has done well with it. So it is a preference of Marty's. There's just certain players who have shown either through their play or have expressed as much to Marty that they're uncomfortable on their offside. And so those players get to stay on their natural side, or their strong side, if you will. But the preference is definitely for any forward to play on his off wing. Any winger, I should say, to play on his off wing.
Yeah. St. Louis, after a game the other night, said this is a one-timers league more and more. And it's not about necessarily the one-timers that you see in the circle on power plays, but it's just how quickly can you release the puck. You get the puck and you shoot it right away. It's just how quickly can you shoot it. And that's obviously one of the main advantages of playing a forward in their off wing. They can shoot it quickly. So, regarding Anderson, you said Anderson's been more comfortable on the right side, his natural side, but I picture him very often attacking by himself, carrying the puck in one of those like individual rushes that he used to do a lot more of under Dominique Ducharme than under Martin St. Louis, who's trying to diversify his game. But when he does those rushes, he does them a lot more from the left side and then cutting to the net rather than from the right side. But so he does it more often from the left than from the right. But generally speaking, the rest of his game definitely has been more comfortable staying on his natural side.
Yeah.
Let's
go to, here. I got one from Matt Rosen, who sent in an email. It's a very long email. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically this is the crux of it. I had a question that stemmed from a conversation you both had this summer about the Canadiens' amateur scouting methodology. I can't remember the exact wording, but you made the point that the Canadiens go incredibly in-depth on the prospects they draft, even going so far as to interview their high school teachers. Mm-hmm. The question that came to mind when I heard this was, has there been any validation that this matters? Have the Habs ever gone back and looked at whether this process actually works better than just focusing on how someone has produced in their draft year? Is it possible that they're massively overthinking this? He goes on to state a bunch of examples. Obviously, the Michkov Reinbacker debate enters into it, but I would say that this is generally how all teams approach the draft. No team, I guess different teams weight them differently, weight production a different amount than sort of the intangibles, some of the character issues that you can learn investigating deeper into a player's background. But every team in the NHL goes deep on a player's background. You have to, it's just, I would say every team in the NHL ingests much of the same information. It's just how you weight that information, different categories of information that differs from team to team. So,
Yeah.
um, but I don't think, I think this is a fair question because, Juraj Slafkovsky did not produce in his draft year, and the Canadiens took him anyway, based on a relatively small sample of international play. Um, and that's the main criticism they get for that pick, and that's fair. You look at other players in their draft year playing in Liga, which is traditionally a very defensive type of league, but Barkov, Laine, some of the other players who were drafted high out of Liga put up better numbers. Actually, the ones who put up the lowest numbers were both drafted by the Canadiens, were Jesperi Kotkaniemi and Juraj Slafkovsky. So, but those are two different administrations, two different kind of philosophies. The one common thread there being Martin Lapointe, but I don't know. I don't think the Canadiens are unique in diving deep on prospects. They might weight it differently than other teams, and maybe they put too much weight on some of the off-ice stuff that they learn about a player, some of the character things. But I don't think that's the case. I think a lot of their scouting is based primarily on eye test, frankly, and viewings and what they see in certain situations of adversity. In Slafkovsky's case, it was the grandeur of the stage that he performed under that really resonated with the Canadiens. Yes, it was a small sample, but the fact that he played his best at the Olympics and played at the World Championships, all these big stage events, and had historic production levels for a player his age, is what resonated with them. Rightly or wrongly, that's what they looked at. It wasn't the character stuff. It wasn't their investigations of him off the ice, even though that was played a part. But the biggest factor was that it was performance based. And I think in Reinbacker's case, very similar. The more they saw him, the more they liked him. The more they saw him play in games in heightening importance, the more they saw him play with the level of competition that he was facing in the Swiss League, the more they liked him. The character stuff, as far as I could tell, the investigations on his background and his character, I think took a back seat to watching him play and liking what they saw.
Yeah. Well, to me, those things are not mutually exclusive. It's all about making sure that no stone is left unturned, because everybody sees the production. They can assess also. Every team will assess the context in which that production happened. What is the environment around the player favorable, less favorable? How did he compensate or react to those parameters, to those circumstances? I think those are things that are primary when it comes to player evaluation. But when Matthew mentions the example of going back to interview high school teachers, it might seem like it's far-fetched or it's not needed, but what they want to know by doing that stuff is, based on the performances that we see now, we can determine how good he is now. But you know how they say that, how the GM and everybody says, well, it's not about how good he is at 18, it's how good he's going to be at 22 or 23. Well, the projection that they establish from 18 to 22, 23 is how good is he at getting better? How good of a student is he? How focused and dedicated to his craft is he? Especially when you're a kid and you let your talent speak, it's not necessarily work all the time that's going to define who you are as a player. It's your natural or your natural domination versus your peers. But as you climb up the ranks, this becomes less and less the case. And it's, how do you work? How much attention do you pay at getting better and at absorbing the information you're giving and making the changes, making the improvements quickly after you've absorbed that information? And where do you get the knowledge of how a kid does that? It's by seeing through the history as far back as you can go to understand, has he been disciplined and interested at getting better, or is he just letting his talent talk? So that's
Mm-hmm.
why it's not mutually exclusive, because on one hand, you've got the pure expression of how good the kid is now, but going through his background helps you understand, or at least reduce the margin of error in your projection, how good he can become.
Right. Okay, let's move on to another one. This is kind of topical. This comes from a longtime listener, Jaideep, who
I don't think it's the same JD.
is it? Oh, maybe not.
Is it? I don't know, because the JD that we know is from Victoria, BC. And this one seems to be...
Well, he said no, but he said he's moved from Victoria to Calgary. I think he mentioned that in the email. So anyway.
Oh, there you go. Oh, yeah. Well, then this is our good old JD.
It's good old JD. So he has a question that's kind of piggybacking on the recent global series where the Leafs had a love-in in Sweden with William Nylander. And so with the Leafs on a successful brand-building exercise abroad in Sweden, I was wondering if you thought the Habs should embark on a similar exercise and whether this is long overdue. Based on the excitement of Leafs media in recent days, it sounds like this was a big win for the team and its marketing efforts, while the Canadiens continue to have a large fan base, as seen by the sight of the tricolor in visiting arenas. It feels like the special status that the team had historically has slipped. Rather than a glamorous, world-famous team, we are now just one of 32 franchises, with our last Stanley Cup coming over 30 years ago in grainy standard definition. The Vegas Golden Knights arguably have more brand cachet than our grandfathers' dusty Canadiens. So, first off, Gary Bettman was in Montreal last season, just kind of randomly. He sort of does that sometimes. He just pops up at a rink and does a media availability for no particular reason. This was one of those times, and he threw out the notion of the Canadiens playing in Paris at some point in the near future. Now, if you know Gary Bettman at all, he doesn't just bounce things randomly. He wouldn't throw that randomly out into the Montreal media space without it having some basis in truth. I firmly believe Bettman would not suggest that as a possibility if it wasn't something that the league was already looking at. So, I can confirm that that's something that the Canadiens have been working on for next fall. Is it going to happen? Not sure yet, but they've been working on this. Yeah, so that's
in Paris specifically,
and they were working on it at the time that Gary Bettman said that. Is my point? So. Jaideep mentioned Paris or London as natural fits. Paris is obviously the natural fit for the Canadiens. The NHL has not played a game in Paris. This would be a perfect opportunity for them to do so. I don't know if they would do it. You know, the problem with Paris is that there's no French star from France, I should say, to market the game around the way that Nylander, Joel Eriksson Ek, there was a number of Swedish players that they sort of picked teams that had a strongish Swedish presence to play in Sweden. You couldn't really do the same, but I could see them having like kind of a combined, maybe like a Paris Cologne kind of mishmash global series where you have like a couple of venues, get Stützle over there, get Draisaitl over there. Use Paris. I mean, that's just me spitballing. I haven't heard anything to that effect, but I think Germany's also on the radar to host some global series games, and it would make a whole lot of sense to me to have a joint sort of German-French collaboration with the Canadiens involved, obviously, in the games in Paris.
Yeah, well, even if France is in Europe, I would find the National Hockey League going to France a little bit closer to going to Australia rather than going to Sweden, because the state of hockey in France, I mean, it's been really difficult for the Ligue Magnus to really steer a lot of interest and establish breaking new grounds, whereas Sweden, I mean, is a hotbed for hockey, and Germany, as you just pointed out, Germany is an emerging market when it comes to hockey, but they've been producing high-end talent at a rate that's really, you cannot ignore that. Where it's not at all the situation with France. I mean, right now there are two French players in the whole of National Hockey Leagues. There's Alexandre Texier and good old Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, who's 96 years old. No.
Sorry,
Non, mais
Pierre-Edouard.
Pierre-Edouard,
I'm not.
c'est une blague, Pierre-Edouard, c'est une blague. No, honestly, he's
Antoine's
been,
thoughts and feelings do not reflect the feelings of the podcast. They are his
that's it.
independent thoughts and opinions. Just
No,
gonna
no,
put that disclaimer out there for the next time we
that's
run
right.
into Pierre-Edouard. Yeah.
That's right. No, he's 38 years old and he's still kicking. He's a highly respected veteran in the team, in the league. And, you know, teams that do well tend to call for his services after. He's never been
Absolutely.
Right now he plays for Seattle
and has a hell of a story. I mean, his backstory is great and his upbringing and everything. So anyhow, all that to say, sorry, Pierre-Edouard Belmont. Yeah.
But they don't have a Draisaitl, they don't have a Moritz Seider, they don't have the Reichels, etc. So or Peterka. So Stutzler. In that sense, it would be Stutzler. Yeah. So if the Canadians were to go there, it would probably help, you know, creating a connection between, you know, the French aspect of Montreal and being in France. But there's a lot of groundwork to do to really ignite the interest of French people towards hockey. I think it can be done, but they're getting only pennies in terms of you know, fundings and they've had a hard time attracting also talent that is, you know, guys that are obviously not good enough to be in the NHL. But when you choose to go, you know, when you're stuck in the AHL or in the ECHL and you say, okay, it's time for me to have a new beginning, you turn to Europe. Well, obviously KHL it used to be the prime destination, but Switzerland is probably the top of the list. After that, you look at Sweden, you look at Finland, you look at Germany, and France goes way down the list. So
yeah, but that would be kind of the point, you know. I mean, that's why your initial analogy with Australia is apt. But the added value, well, it's not added; it was the same value in Australia. Is the added value if you pick the Canadians and say another team with a strong Quebecois or French Canadian presence on it, at least being able to go and speak the language and appear on the news and go on talk shows and do sort of a media circuit in France and be able to do so in French. Would help.
Right.
Would help pump up the game, and it would help grow. You know, make this more of an event than it otherwise would. And so, but listen, it's to answer the question. Yes, the Canadians need to be in one of these high-profile international events. They do. They're pursuing it. The league wants it to happen. This is not a non-issue. It's definitely front burner, I think, for both the league and the Canadians.
One more question, Arpin, maybe?
We'll do one more, yeah. And then I gotta go to the airport.
Okay, sounds good. Listen, we had a question earlier about drafting and looking into criteria to develop to draft some players. There's a question about development here from Alex, who says, "I'm wondering if you could provide your thoughts on the current debate happening around Habland about development and letting players stew for a year in Europe, for example, Slavkovsky, and how much that truly makes a difference. Joel Armia stayed in Finland 2 extra years after his draft year, and we all know it did nothing for his development." I'm not sure about that. I can't help but think people are getting caught up in the minutiae of where development happens, AHL versus NHL, for example, which, in my opinion, is irrelevant. So it's interesting because I want to pick up on what you were saying about Slav earlier and how he was drafted based on what he did in the international level rather than how he played in Liga in Finland. But one of the reasons why the Canadians did not want him to go back there is they felt as though the team that he was playing for, Turku, was not the right environment for him to develop. And they thought in some cases it might be relevant to send the player back in Europe. And in other cases, depending on, his situation over there, it's better for us to keep him close to us. That's the decision they made with Slavkovsky. With Reinbacher, they looked at the organization in Kloten and said, we know the people in Kloten, we trust them, we think he's in a good environment. So let's have Reinbacher go back there for a season. And next thing you know, less than 2 months within the start of the season, Jerry Fleming gets fired by Clutton. So it might be a good environment. It was not good enough for the managers
Yeah.
over there.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely one that so far has backfired. Listen, it's early. Um, they did have a certain. There were a lot of people in the organization. I wrote a story earlier with all the connections that Jerry Fleming has. Worked with JF Hull. Uh, the list goes on and on. Anyhow, so they did. There were a lot of people within the organization who felt comfortable and were happy that Jerry Fleming was in charge there. Obviously, he's not anymore. Reinbacher's start to the year has been riddled with injury and sort of inconsistent play. So it's a bit of a. I think it goes to show to what extent it's a bit of a crapshoot. You know, I mean, it's like you think that the kid has a good environment. Another guy I think of is Oliver Kapanen, who doesn't really show up on the radar much. He was, a pretty high draft pick, but he's been forgotten about, and he's showing some pretty interesting things playing in Finland this year, and so I think it's really dependent on which player. I mean, I always kind of think of Mikko Rantanen, which is sort of the example that comes up a lot when discussing why didn't Slavkovsky play in the AHL last year. Because Mikko Rantanen, after being drafted, came to North America, played his 9 games in Colorado, and spent the rest of the year in the AHL with the San Antonio Rampage. Got 60 points in 52 games, and that was it. From that point on, he was an NHL player and scored 20 goals his rookie year and has never looked back. So there are different paths for different players. It's when you think of Slavkovsky's path, is the fact that he had one unproductive half season in the NHL in his draft plus 1 year signs that he's a bust? No. Other players have had similarly poor results in their first season. He didn't even get to finish his first season. But this notion that I guess the answer is that there is no one size fits all answer to this question. I know that's kind of a lame answer, but for some players it's better to stay in Europe and stew a little bit or marinate. For others it's not. It really depends. Jesse Ulonen's a guy who spent a couple of years in Finland after being drafted, came over, played a couple of years in the AHL. I think he spent 1 year actually in Finland.
Arturi Lehkonen stayed 2 years after his draft,
right?
In Finland too, and actually did Finland.
No, in Sweden. In Sweden, and actually that helped him immensely. I mean, playing in Gothenburg, he's talked about it a lot. How that taught him. They have a more NHL style program there with Frölunda, right? Yeah. So he won a championship there. He learned a lot about transitioning from more of a European style to an NHL style. And anyone who looks at Arturi Lehkonen, I mean, that guy is the epitome of an NHL style forward. Learned a lot of that in Gothenburg, so it benefited him a great deal. So for some players, it does. For others, it's better to get them on North American ice and into an actual North American system as quickly as possible. I think one thing that's in the discourse around the development of prospects around the Canadians is there seems
that
to be
they do it the wrong way.
Well, no, but that there is a wrong way, or that there is a right way, and that it's true to everyone. That it has to be this way. If you don't do it this way, it's wrong, and if you do it this way, it's right, and it's guaranteed success versus guaranteed failure. It's not, it's not all absolutes. Only the Sith. Only the Sith talks in absolutes. That's my little Star Wars reference, but it's that's it. It's not all absolutes. It's not all going to be resolved within 1 or 2 years. It's just not reality. I mean, again, the notion of who's going to be the best at 22 or 23. Look at he's not lighting the world on fire, but I think everyone should look at Jesperi Kotkaniemi right now and what he's doing with Carolina at the age of 22 and say, okay, he's not a superstar, and I don't think anyone ever really projected him to be a superstar, but he's a very highly effective player on a very good team, who's leading that team in scoring right now. He's becoming the player the Canadians saw in him when they took him number 3. Is he ever going to equal Brady Tkachuk? Obviously not. But he is reaching sort of fruition at this age, and exposing him to the expectations in the NHL and in Montreal in particular at a very young age, in hindsight, was probably a mistake. But given time, given a change of environment, given a definite lessening of scrutiny in Carolina, and just being given an organization that still invested a lot in him. Listen, they went out, they made that offer sheet, they gave him a big contract, so it's not as if there's no pressure to perform there, but it's obviously a different, more nurturing environment than he had in Montreal, particularly under Marc Bergevin, who stuck his neck out drafting him at number 3 and made it clear on numerous occasions that he kind of regretted doing that. So you gotta look at that case and be like, okay, maybe what I thought was obvious when the kid was 19 or 20 isn't all that obvious after all. And it's a good sort of case study to look at. And I don't know if Kotkaniemi is going to lead the team in scoring. Like, he probably won't. Al has been injured a little bit, but there's definitely something there that I think there's a lesson there to be drawn in terms of how you look at these kids and how you look at development curves and finished products.
I'll give you another name, Quinton Byfield. You're about to leave for LA. Well, yeah. Quinton Byfield, second pick overall in 2020, didn't exactly light the world on fire in his first 2 seasons. He had 5 goals and 10 points in his first 40 games in 21-22. He bounced between NHL and AHL, and now he's in his third real season with the Kings, and he's finally taking off. He's 21 years old, and he's got 14 points in 16 games. He's been converted to, he's a full-time winger, and he's getting the job done now. Mm-hmm. And he's finally blossoming, but it's not something that happened.
The commonality between him and Slav is that they're bigger guys. And even Kotkaniemi to some extent, but really him and Slav is that they're bigger guys. It takes bigger guys longer sometimes to figure out how best to use that combination of size and skill and how that translates to the NHL.
That's it. So, we'll see for Reinbacher if they'll still judge at the end of the season that Cloten's the right place for him. I expect him to be whether in Montreal or in Laval next year. And you mentioned Oliver Kapanen. That's another guy that should be in Laval next season. So thanks for sending us your questions. So I remind you that you can reach us on Twitter at Basu and Godin. That's our handle. Or by email at basuandgodin@gmail.com. Arpin, you're leaving for California. I am not, but we're going to nonetheless, despite the time difference, talk to each other on Friday. So enjoy California. And everybody, well, thanks for listening to The Notebook, and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe either on any of your podcast platforms or on YouTube. Talk to you Friday.
Yeah. And write a message, write a little comment also. That's good. We like that. All right. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye.